what if the very act of creating life was the greatest moral wrong? What if bringing a child into the world is not an expression of love, but a deep-seated failure, a mistake in a world that is suffocating under the weight of suffering, overpopulation, and impending environmental collapse? These questions aren't abstract concepts or mere thought exercises. They are central to one of the most controversial and discomforting philosophical movements of our time, antinatalism. The notion of antinatalism challenges the very core of human existence, the instinct to reproduce, to continue the species, to create life. It demands we confront a harsh reality. Is it right to have children, knowing the suffering, pain, and existential turmoil they will inevitably face in a world that seems to be falling apart? This is not an easily answered question. It challenges our very nature, our most basic instincts, and calls into question the meaning of life itself. To ask whether it is morally wrong to bring a child into the world is to question the morality of existence. As we explore the complexities of antinatalism, we will delve into the arguments put forth by philosophers, psychologists, and even those who have experienced firsthand the challenges of raising children in a world rife with suffering. We'll examine the psychological underpinnings of why some believe procreation is a moral crime, while others maintain that life is worth living despite its many pains. The tension in this debate doesn't simply lie in the question itself, but in the broader implications. If the act of having children is inherently wrong, what does that say about the future of humanity? Is this just an intellectual exercise, or is there something more profound at play? To understand antinatalism fully, we must first journey back through history, through the minds of philosophers who dared to question humanity's most fundamental instinct, the will to procreate. The seeds of antinatalism were planted long before modern debates arose. In the 19th century, the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer became one of the earliest and most influential thinkers to challenge the morality of procreation. For Schopenhauer, life itself was defined by suffering, and this suffering was not limited to any individual. It was universal. He argued that bringing new life into the world was an act of cruelty, for every person who was born would inevitably experience pain, disappointment, and ultimately death. Schopenhauer's philosophy was rooted in pessimism, seeing the human condition as fundamentally flawed. He believed that the act of reproduction only perpetuates this cycle of suffering, with each new generation doomed to face the same struggles. In his view, the most humane act was to avoid bringing children into such a world. But Schopenhauer was not alone. Fast forward to the 20th century, and we find the philosopher David Benatar, a contemporary voice who further developed the case for antinatalism in his book, Better Never to Have Been. Benatar posited that coming into existence is always a harm, because life, by its very nature, entails suffering. He argued that even the most positive experiences cannot offset the inevitable pain of life. According to Benatar, bringing children into this world, despite the good they might experience, ultimately subjects them to more harm than good. For him, the argument was not merely philosophical. It was an ethical imperative to prevent harm by not bringing new life into existence. What makes antinatalism so compelling today is that it speaks to the growing anxiety of our times. Environmental destruction, societal breakdown, and existential uncertainty In a world where resources are dwindling, political systems seem to fail at addressing global crises, and the planet is suffocating under the burden of climate change. The philosophy of antinatalism becomes more than just an intellectual exercise. It's a direct response to modern fears about the future. As our awareness of environmental collapse increases, the idea of antinatalism gains more relevance. The growing sense of unease about the world's future, the fear of bringing children into an unstable and potentially dangerous world, mirrors the concerns that Schopenhauer and Benatar first expressed centuries ago. The fear of suffering has taken on new dimensions, compounded by the very real possibility of ecological disaster, economic instability, and political chaos. The philosophy of antinatalism doesn't merely rely on intellectual reasoning, it also taps into deep psychological truths about human nature. To understand why some people adopt this view, we need to explore the psychology behind it. Humans have long been obsessed with the concept of suffering. It's an integral part of our consciousness, from the earliest moments of life to our final days. The human brain is wired to focus on pain, loss, and fear, emotions that dominate our waking hours and shape the way we view existence. This psychological bias toward suffering, known as negativity bias, makes us more sensitive to negative events than to positive ones, creating a worldview where pain outweighs joy. For antinatalists, this psychological framework can lead to a pessimistic view of life. Suffering is seen not as an unfortunate byproduct of life, but as its very essence. If suffering is unavoidable, then bringing a new being into the world only subjects them to that inevitable torment. The psychological weight of this perspective is not just intellectual, but deeply emotional. It reflects an existential fear of the human condition itself. One of the core psychological factors that fuel antinatalism is nihilism, the belief that life lacks inherent meaning or purpose. Nihilistic thinkers argue that since life is ultimately meaningless, the act of procreation becomes morally questionable. Why bring someone into a world that has no inherent purpose? Why create life only to subject it to inevitable suffering? This existential anxiety is compounded for those who experience depression, a condition that can magnify the feeling that life is a burden. For individuals struggling with depression, the idea of existence itself becomes unbearable. In such a mental state, the act of bringing a child into the world might seem not only irresponsible, but cruel. Antinatalism, in this sense, can be seen as a response to personal and collective anxiety. It reflects a desire to protect others from the anguish and despair that one might experience in life. It is an emotional reaction to the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that comes with facing the vastness of the universe, the certainty of suffering, and the eventuality of death. At its core, antinatalism is fueled by a profound fear. The fear of suffering, the fear of helplessness, and the fear of leaving future generations to face the harsh realities of the world. This fear is not just abstract, it's palpable. From climate change to political turmoil to global inequality, the world seems increasingly unstable. With these fears comes the temptation to shield others, especially children, from a future that feels both uncertain and grim. For many antinatalists, the fear of what might befall a child is enough to make them question the morality of reproduction. They argue that it's better to spare future generations from suffering, regardless of the joys they might experience. This psychological fear creates a moral quandary. Should we risk bringing a new life into the world, knowing the likelihood of hardship, pain, and suffering? Or is it better to refrain from creating new life altogether, thereby removing the risk of harm? Antinatalism challenges not only the individual, but the very fabric of society. What happens to a world where fewer and fewer people choose to have children? Is it the birth of a new, enlightened society, or the collapse of everything we know? At its heart, procreation is not just a personal choice, it's a social one. The decision to have children is deeply embedded in the cultural, economic, and psychological structures of societies worldwide. Family units are the cornerstone of most cultures, serving as a foundation for social organization, economic systems, and emotional bonds. The idea of discontinuing this cycle by refusing to have children is not just a personal stance, it's a radical social and cultural shift. In a world dominated by antinatalism, we would see the slow erosion of the traditional family structure, where parenting, child-rearing, and generational legacy would become less common. The implications of such a shift would be profound, leading to changes in everything from education systems and economic productivity to social relationships and community building. A world with fewer children wouldn't just affect the family unit, it would also have significant economic consequences. In many countries, the workforce is already shrinking, and without new generations of young workers, economies could face a future of stagnation. The global economy depends on a steady flow of young workers to drive innovation, production, and consumption. Without this influx, industries would slow, social security systems would collapse, and countries would face an aging population with fewer resources to care for them. Moreover, the rise of automation and artificial intelligence could mitigate some of these concerns, but it also raises the question: if society isn't investing in the next generation, what does that say about our view of the future? A society without children may turn inward, focusing on the preservation of existing generations, leading to a more insular and individualistic culture, which would further distance humanity from its collective sense of purpose. Another crucial impact of antinatalism is the potential loss of intergenerational bonds. Family ties, history, and legacy are built on the foundation of passing knowledge, traditions, and experiences from one generation to the next. Without children, this continuity is threatened. There would be no one to inherit family stories, to carry on personal and cultural legacies, or to maintain the ties that bind communities together. In addition to the loss of personal legacy, the very concept of the future begins to fade. Societies are built around the idea of progress, of improving the world for future generations. Without children, there is no next generation to make those improvements. The future itself becomes a nebulous concept, and the value of progress comes into question. While the consequences of antinatalism may sound bleak, the counterargument is clear. Human beings have always found meaning and joy in procreation. For many, the act of raising children is seen as one of the most fulfilling parts of life. The family unit, despite its flaws, remains the primary source of love, connection, and belonging for countless people. Moreover, the argument that life is inherently full of suffering ignores the moments of beauty, joy, and fulfillment that accompany existence. It's important to acknowledge that while life can be painful, it can also be immensely rewarding. The love between parent and child, the creation of families, and the continuation of culture and tradition are not simply duties. They are sources of profound joy and connection that define the human experience.
In the 21st century, antinatalism resonates more deeply than ever before.
as humanity faces unprecedented challenges. The global crises that have emerged in recent decades, the climate emergency, political instability, economic inequality, and the looming threat of overpopulation provide fertile ground for the antinatalist argument. Take the climate crisis, for example. As the world's ecosystems deteriorate, the environment suffers from deforestation, pollution, and the effects of climate change. Rising sea levels, extreme weather patterns, and resource shortages all point to a bleak future. In this context, the act of procreation becomes fraught with ethical concerns. Why bring a child into a world that is on the brink of ecological collapse? What kind of life can a new generation expect in a world where the resources needed for survival are rapidly depleting? Antinatalism, in this sense, becomes a response to the growing fear that the world is no longer capable of sustaining future generations. It's a philosophy that asks, is it ethical to burden a child with the inevitable suffering that comes from living in a world teetering on the edge of environmental disaster? The argument against procreation is further compounded by the ongoing issue of overpopulation. The global population is expected to reach nearly 10 billion by 2050, putting immense pressure on resources such as food, water, and energy. In many parts of the world, scarcity is already a stark reality. In crowded cities, polluted air, limited access to clean water, and the overconsumption of natural resources are daily challenges faced by millions. Antinatalism, therefore, becomes a logical extension of the fear of overpopulation. With a growing population and finite resources, bringing more children into the world seems both irresponsible and unsustainable. For those who embrace the antinatalist philosophy, the act of procreation is no longer just a personal choice. It becomes a moral issue, an ethical decision that must take into account the ecological and social consequences of adding more lives to an already strained world. The modern world is defined by a sense of uncertainty. We live in an age of constant upheaval. Political chaos, economic volatility, and global pandemics shape our daily lives. This uncertainty creates an environment where the future seems less promising and more perilous. Psychological research suggests that living in a state of constant crisis can lead to feelings of helplessness, anxiety, and depression. For many, the overwhelming sense of living in a broken world makes the idea of bringing a child into it seem cruel. If the world is unstable, full of suffering, and headed for an uncertain future, how can we justify adding another person to it? How can we, in good conscience, bring a child into a society that is defined by conflict, inequality, and ecological ruin? The rise of antinatalism also speaks to a broader disillusionment with the systems that govern our societies. Governments, corporations, and powerful elites seem increasingly disconnected from the needs of the common people. Inequality is rising, and opportunities for social mobility are shrinking. Education, healthcare, and basic human rights are increasingly seen as privileges, not entitlements. In a world where the systems designed to protect and nurture us seem to fail, the instinct to have children can feel not only naive, but reckless. At the core of the antinatalist argument is a moral question that cuts to the very heart of human existence. Is it right to bring a child into the world? The decision to have children has long been seen as one of the most sacred and fundamental aspects of human life. For centuries, it has been linked to legacy, family, and societal continuity. But antinatalism flips this narrative on its head, suggesting that the act of procreation is not a selfless gift, but a selfish one. Antinatalists argue that, from an ethical standpoint, it is wrong to bring a child into a world that is marked by suffering, inequality, and uncertainty. In this view, reproduction is seen as an act of negligence, as it condemns a new life to inevitable pain, hardship, and possibly an early death in a world where environmental, political, and economic conditions are rapidly deteriorating. It raises the fundamental question, are parents who decide to bring children into such a world acting out of love and hope? Or are they committing an ethical transgression by subjecting their children to a life they themselves would never willingly choose? In stark contrast to the antinatalist view is the traditional belief that parenthood is one of the most fulfilling and meaningful aspects of life. For many, bringing a child into the world is an act of love, a way to perpetuate the family legacy, and a means of contributing to the future of humanity. Parenthood is not seen as an act of cruelty, but as a natural, moral, and joyous part of the human experience. Supporters of this view argue that while suffering is inherent to life, it is also accompanied by beauty, love, and personal fulfillment. The act of nurturing and raising a child is seen as one of life's greatest privileges, a responsibility that brings purpose and meaning. In this narrative, life's hardships are part of the human condition, but do not diminish the value of existence. Parenthood, therefore, is not about avoiding pain, but about creating a future that will be shaped by the values, love, and lessons passed down from one generation to the next. The debate between antinatalism and procreation also brings up the tension between personal choice and collective responsibility. Is it morally acceptable to bring a child into the world knowing the potential suffering they may face? Or does society have an ethical obligation to ensure that every new life is born into a world that is capable of supporting it? For antinatalists, the ethical dilemma is clear. The burden of suffering, environmental destruction, and societal breakdown is too great to justify the creation of new life. On the other hand, proponents of parenthood argue that it is an individual's right to decide if they wish to have children, and that the act of procreation is inherently good regardless of the suffering it may bring. Ultimately, this moral dilemma poses difficult questions about the nature of responsibility, both personal and societal. It challenges the audience to consider their own views on parenthood, morality, and the role they believe individuals and societies should play in shaping the future. As we reach the end of our exploration into the philosophy of antinatalism, we are left with a question that is both personal and universal. What does it mean to create life, and what responsibility does that act entail? The debate between those who argue that it is morally wrong to bring children into a suffering world and those who believe that life, with all its pain and beauty, is worth living, is not one with easy answers. The reality is that both sides are deeply intertwined with the human condition, our fears, hopes, and the psychological and societal structures that shape our decisions. For some, the choice to have children is an act of optimism, an investment in the future, and a continuation of humanity's collective journey. For others, it is an ethical gamble, one that risks condemning another person to a life filled with unavoidable suffering. Antinatalism forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that no matter how hard we try, suffering will always be a part of existence. But it also asks us to question whether we should perpetuate that cycle by bringing new life into the world. One of the most profound aspects of this debate is the idea that the decision to have children is not simply a personal one. It is a moral choice that shapes the future of humanity. To bring a child into the world is to make a decision not just for oneself, but for society, for the generations that will follow. But with this decision comes an immense responsibility. As global crises continue to escalate and the world faces ever-growing challenges, the very nature of procreation becomes more fraught with ethical complexity. It's no longer just about the love between parent and child. It's about ensuring that the world into which we bring new life is one that is worthy of that life. The power of choice is what makes this moral dilemma so profound. It forces us to examine our values, our priorities, and our understanding of what it means to live a meaningful life. In a world filled with uncertainty, antinatalism provides a critical perspective that challenges us to reflect on our actions, our obligations, and the consequences of our decisions. As we close this exploration, it's clear that the question of whether to have children will continue to be one of the most profound and controversial debates of our time. There is no simple answer, only the acknowledgement that the act of creating life is one that carries both great potential and immense responsibility. In the end, the choice to have children is a deeply personal one, shaped by individual beliefs, societal values, and the ever-changing realities of the world around us. It is a decision that calls for introspection, empathy, and a deep understanding of the moral implications it carries. What remains is the undeniable fact that, despite the many challenges, life itself, the very act of existence, holds immense meaning. Whether we choose to bring children into the world or not, our responsibility is to ensure that the world we leave behind is one that is worthy of that inheritance. The future of humanity rests not just on our ability to sustain life, but on our capacity to create a world where future generations can thrive, not just survive.